I am a wildlife biologist with a master's degree in ecology from the University of New Mexico, and I have spent 8 years working for a state agency doing population surveys and habitat assessments across the desert Southwest. I have logged thousands of hours in the field across Arizona, New Mexico, and the Colorado Plateau, and I know what animals look like, how they move and behave, and how to distinguish between a normal animal and something that requires a second look. I've seen mountain lions at close range. I've encountered bears in the dark and have tracked and observed species that most people never see in the wild. I know the difference between being scared because something looks dangerous and something is wrong in a way that my training cannot account for. I am writing this because the second kind of scared is what I felt on 2 consecutive nights in the Navajo Nation backcountry in September 3 years ago, and I have not been able to find a category in my professional knowledge to put it in since. I was conducting a small mammal survey in a remote section of the Colorado Plateau near the New Mexico border, working alone on a 3-day field assignment that I had done versions of dozens of times before. The survey required setting and checking live traps at specific intervals along established transect lines, which meant being active in the field during the specific low-light hours around dusk and dawn when small mammal activity was highest. My camp was a solo tent set up near a dry wash with a fire ring from previous use, about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. No cell signal. Satellite communicator for emergency use. All standard for field work of this type in that part of the country. The first night I was checking the last traps on my evening transect around 9, which meant I was working in full dark with a headlamp, which is also completely standard. This particular transect ran along a sandstone ridge with a shallow canyon visible below on the left side and open plateau on the right. I had been working the transect for about 90 minutes and was on the last quarter mile when I heard the horses. I say I heard them because that is exactly what it sounded like. The specific sound of hooves on hard rock, the particular rhythm of a large animal moving at a walk across sandstone. There were wild horses in that general region. The Navajo Nation had significant feral horse populations, and encountering them at night was not unprecedented, though it was uncommon enough to note. I turned my headlamp toward the canyon side of the ridge where the sound was coming from. The canyon below the ridge dropped maybe 30 feet and then opened into a flat, sandy area maybe 40 yards wide. In the flat area below, I could see 3 horses moving through it, their forms visible in the headlamp reach. Large animals, moving in a loose group at a walking pace, completely normal in every visible respect. I watched them for a minute and then turned back to my traps and continued working. What I noticed on the way back along the transect was that the sound of the hooves below me was pacing me, keeping time with my walking pace. When I walked faster, the hoof sounds accelerated. When I slowed, they slowed. I want to be clear that I was not attributing intent to this in any dramatic sense. Animals sometimes pace along ridgelines for reasons related to curiosity or territory, and horses were certainly capable of following movement above them out of interest. But I slowed and stopped specifically to test it, and the sounds below slowed and stopped. And then I started again, and they started again. And by the 3rd or 4th test, I was doing this specific thing that a person with my training does when they encounter data that does not fit a comfortable model, which is to stop attributing it to coincidence. I reached the end of the transect and the trail back to camp, and the hoof sounds below me continued for approximately 1 more minute and then stopped. I went back to camp and made dinner and wrote up my field notes. And the entry for that evening notes the horses in the canyon below the south transect, and notes the unusual pacing behavior without drawing a specific conclusion about it. The second evening is the part I've never been able to write in any field log because field logs are professional documents, and what happened the second evening does not belong in a professional document, which should tell you something about what I'm about to describe. I was on the same transect, roughly the same timing, same headlamp, and trap checking routine. I was about halfway along the ridge when I heard the horses again below me in the canyon, the same rhythmic hoof sounds on sandstone. I turned my headlamp toward the canyon and found the flat sandy area with my beam, and what I saw below me was not 3 horses. It was one, standing in the center of the flat, sandy area, facing the canyon wall below the ridge where I was standing, facing directly toward me, its head up and oriented in my direction. I want to be precise about the distance and the lighting. My headlamp was a high-output field lamp, and at 30 feet of vertical distance plus whatever horizontal distance I was from the canyon edge, the animal was within the effective range of the beam. I could see it clearly enough to note details. I stood there and looked at it, and it stood there and looked in my direction, and then I noticed the first thing that was wrong. It was not making a sound. 4 legs on sandstone, not moving, no sound. The hoof sounds I had heard that brought my attention to the canyon had stopped the moment I turned my headlamp on it. This could have multiple explanations. The animal had stopped moving when the light hit it. Animals frequently freeze when a light source finds them. I stood there with my beam on it for what I estimate was about 90 seconds. Then it moved. It took 3 steps toward the canyon wall directly below me, and I tracked it with my headlamp as it did, and as it moved into a slightly different position, I saw the second thing that was wrong. The proportions were not right. This was the moment that my training became relevant in a way I did not want it to be relevant. I know horse proportions the way I know small mammal proportions, the way I know bird wingspans and reptile scale patterns, with the specific visual fluency of thousands of hours of professional observation. The animal below me had a shoulder height that was correct for a horse, the neck length was correct, the general body mass was correct, the leg length was not correct. The legs were too long and too thin in the lower section, below the knee joint, in a proportion that a horse's leg does not produce. I am being as precise as I can when I say that this was not a matter of the headlamp creating distortion or the angle of view creating a foreshortening effect. The legs were wrong in the specific way that a structural biologist recognizes as wrong. The ratio of bone length to joint height was not the ratio of a horse. I kept the beam on it and stood completely still, and it turned its head directly toward me. And what I saw in the headlamp beam on its face stopped me from breathing for a period of time I cannot accurately estimate. Its eyes were forward-facing. I want you to understand what that means if you are not familiar with animal anatomy. Horses are prey animals. Prey animals have eyes on the sides of their heads, providing wide-angle vision for detecting threats from multiple directions. Eyes positioned on the front of the face, providing overlapping binocular vision for depth perception, is a feature of predators, of animals that hunt, of animals that need to judge distance precisely. Horses do not have forward-facing eyes. This animal did. I turned off my headlamp. I do not know exactly why I did this. It was not a conscious decision, more of a whole-body response to what I was processing. And in the complete dark of the canyon below the ridge, where the animal had been standing when I turned the light off, I heard a sound that I've written down in exactly these words in the personal log I keep separately from my field notes because I needed to record it somewhere and could not put it in an official document. The sound was not a horse sound. It was a low, sustained vocalization with a harmonic quality of vocal production that required a larynx and resonating chamber of a type and complexity that a horse does not possess that could produce what I was hearing. It lasted for approximately 4 seconds and then stopped completely. I walked back to camp at a pace that I will describe as controlled, and that was significantly faster than my normal field pace, and I did not turn my headlamp back on until I was well away from the canyon edge and oriented toward camp. I reached my tent, got inside, and sat there with my satellite communicator in my hand for a long time, debating whether the thing I had seen constituted an emergency. I decided it did not, by the definition of emergency that the device was meant to address, and I put it down and sat there until the specific quality of the silence outside my tent was no longer producing the feeling of being listened to from a direction I could not identify. I broke camp the following morning, well before my survey work was complete, and I drove back to the agency office and filed a report saying that field conditions at the survey site had prevented completion of the transect work. My supervisor accepted this without significant follow-up, which was fortunate because the actual field conditions I experienced were not something I knew how to describe in the language of a professional wildlife report. I told one colleague about what I had seen, a woman who had grown up on the Navajo Nation and who had worked in field biology for 15 years. I described everything I have described here: the proportion of the legs, the forward-facing eyes, the vocalization. She listened without any of the skepticism I had expected, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that what I had described was consistent with accounts she had heard her entire life, and that I should not go back to that survey area. She did not use any specific term for what I had seen. She did not need to. The way she said I should not go back told me what she believed I had encountered more clearly than any specific terminology would have. I have not gone back. The survey was reassigned to a different team the following season. I submitted a request for reassignment from that specific region, citing personal reasons, which was approved without question. I am still a wildlife biologist, and I still do field work in different areas. And I take the satellite communicator, and I do not work alone in canyon country after dark, which is a professional accommodation I have made for myself that no training protocol requires and that I have not explained to anyone at the agency. I have told this account to 2 people in 3 years, and I am writing it now because I am still looking for the professional category that contains what I saw, and I have come to accept that I am not going to find it inside my professional training, and that the category that fits the description of a large animal with wrong proportions and forward-facing eyes that produces vocalizations no animal in that region can produce is a category that exists in the knowledge of the people who have lived in that canyon country for thousands of years, and that their knowledge is older and more comprehensive on this specific subject than anything I learned in graduate school. My brother Derek and I have been camping together since we were kids. The kind of camping where you go deep enough into the woods that you cannot hear vehicles passing on the roads or see any lights from any human civilization, not the kind where you park next to other families with RVs and fire rings with metal grates. We had been doing it our whole lives in different parts of the country, and we were both comfortable in the backcountry in a way that only comes from years of genuine experience. I want to establish that up front because the 2 of us are not the people who easily get scared in the woods, but what happened on a 4-night trip in the mountains of northern New Mexico 2 summers ago scared both of us badly enough that Derek, who has never in his life backed away from anything, told me on the drive home that he was not going back into those specific mountains again and that I should not either. We had chosen a trailhead in the Carson National Forest that accessed a high-elevation basin with a creek and a series of meadows that Derek had found on a topographic map, not a destination that appeared in any guidebook or trail review site we could find, which was exactly what we were looking for. The approach was about 7 miles, and we went in on a Thursday, planning to come back out Monday. 5 days, 4 nights, a part of New Mexico that neither of us had been to before. We were well supplied and well equipped, and we had told my girlfriend the exact trailhead location and our planned route. The first night was genuinely good. We made camp in a flat area at the edge of the first meadow, about 3 miles past where the maintained trail ended, and we had a fire and ate well and sat up later than we should have, just being in the specific quality of a high mountain night in northern New Mexico, which has a clarity and a silence and a star field that is hard to find many other places. Nothing happened the first night. The woods were quiet in a normal way, meaning not silent but filled with the sounds that a healthy mountain forest produces at night, the kind that becomes background and lets you sleep. The second night is where I need to begin paying close attention to sequence and detail, because everything that followed built on what started then. Derek woke me up at some point after midnight. I did not check the time immediately, by putting his hand on my shoulder and saying my name quietly. I came awake and he was sitting up in his sleeping bag and pointing toward the meadow beyond our camp. I followed his pointing and looked at the meadow, and in the available moonlight, I could see across the open grass to the tree line on the far side, maybe 200 yards. Standing at the far tree line was a coyote, which I could see clearly enough to identify as such, even at 200 yards in moonlight, because I had seen a lot of coyotes, and the size and shape were consistent. It was standing facing our camp, which coyotes did not typically do, They typically move through and away, but I had seen coyotes stop and orient toward a camp before when they smelled food. Not alarming. I told Derek it was a coyote and he said he knew that, but that it had been standing exactly in that position when he woke up to use the bathroom about 20 minutes earlier, had been standing in exactly that position when he came back to the tent, and was still standing in exactly that position now, 20 minutes after that. 20 minutes of the same animal in the same stance in the same location at the far edge of the meadow facing our camp. I had never seen a coyote maintain any position for 20 minutes for any reason. They were almost never still. We watched it from the tent for another 10 minutes and it did not move. Then Derek turned his headlamp on and pointed it across the meadow at the animal, which was the normal response to a persistent coyote that you wanted to scare off. And for the 2 or 3 seconds that the beam was crossing the meadow toward the tree line, the animal was there, and then the beam found the tree line and the animal was not there. Not running away, not visible moving through the meadow grass, not present in any direction the headlamp could reach. Gone between the moment the beam was crossing the meadow and the moment the beam arrived at the tree line where it had been standing. I want to be precise about that because the meadow was open grass and the moonlight was good, and if the animal had turned and run into the forest, we would have seen it moving through the grass before it reached the trees. And if it had simply turned and entered the trees at the position where it had been standing, we would have seen it in the headlamp beam for the fraction of a second before it entered the trees. We saw neither. The beam arrived at the tree line and there was nothing there. We talked about it for a while and did not come to a satisfying conclusion and eventually went back to sleep. And I want to be honest that my explanation for falling back asleep was exhaustion rather than comfort because I was not comfortable when my eyes closed. The third night was quiet until about 2 a.m. when both of us woke up at the same time. I know we woke simultaneously because we both sat up and neither of us said anything for about 30 seconds, which meant we were both doing the same thing. Listening to what had woken us and not speaking because speaking would interfere with hearing. What had woken us was a sound from directly outside the tent, on the south side, away from the meadow, from the direction of the forest behind the camp. The sound was not an animal sound, I recognized. I have heard mountain lions, black bears, elk, coyotes, foxes, porcupines, and a significant variety of other species at night in various camp settings over years of backcountry camping. What I heard was a low vocalization with a quality that my brain kept reaching for a category for and not finding one. Not a growl, not a howl, not a bark, something in between all of those things and belonging to none of them, lasting about 3 seconds and then stopping. We lay in the tent for a long time after that. I had a can of bear spray within reach, and Derek had his hunting knife, and we both had our headlamps, and we did not make a sound. We listened to the night outside the tent, and the night outside the tent gave us nothing further. No additional vocalization, no footstep sound, no movement of vegetation. Pure silence for so long that we eventually, reluctantly, went back to sleep. The fourth night is the night I think about most. We had spent the day debating whether to cut the trip short and go out a day early, which Derek had been leaning toward and which I had been resisting because I did not want to make a decision based on things that had rational explanations available, even if those explanations were not satisfying. A coyote that did not move for 20 minutes was unusual, but not impossible. A vocalization I did not recognize could have been any number of species I had not encountered before. I argued for staying and Derek agreed. Reluctantly. We were sitting at the fire around 9 when our camp dog, a 4-year-old cattle dog mix named Scout, who had come on every camping trip we had done for 3 years and who had never once in those 3 years acted in a way that required my attention at a fire, got up from where he was lying and walked to the southern edge of the camp where the forest began, and stood there facing the trees with every muscle in his body rigid, his hackles up the full length of his back, and began a low sustained growl that I'd never heard from him before in 4 years. I went to Scout and crouched beside him and looked in the direction he was looking. The forest at the southern edge of the camp was dark, my headlamp not penetrating far into the trees from where I was crouching, and I could not see anything specific. Scout did not stop growling. Derek came up beside me and we both looked into the trees and neither of us could identify anything visual. Scout kept growling, and at some point in the next minute he stopped growling and instead pressed his body against my leg, which he did sometimes when he was frightened rather than alert. And the shift from alert to frightened in my dog was the specific moment when my rational explanation framework stopped doing its job. Then I saw the light. Not a headlamp, not a flashlight beam, not anything with the quality of artificial light. A low phosphorescent glow, faint enough that I first thought I was imagining it, moving between the trees at approximately 50 yards. Not a continuous glow, but an intermittent one, appearing between one pair of tree trunks and disappearing and reappearing between the next pair, moving steadily parallel to our camp at the same pace a person would walk, moving from left to right across the back of the camp at the forest edge. Derek saw it too. He said nothing, but I felt him stop breathing beside me in the specific way a person stops breathing when they see something they are not ready to speak about yet. We watched the light move across the back of the camp through the trees and disappear to the right where the forest thickened and the trees were too dense to see through. Scout pressed harder against my leg. We put the fire out and went into the tent, and we did not go back to sleep. We sat in the tent with our headlamps on, both of them, and Scout between us, until the sky began to lighten enough to see, and then we broke camp and walked out. 7 miles. We were at the truck before full dark had completely cleared. On the drive south, Derek did not say much for about an hour. Then he said that the light had not been moving like a person with a light source, it had been moving like the light itself was the thing moving, which was a distinction I had also noticed and had not found a way to articulate. He said he had been camping in wild country his whole life and had never seen bioluminescence of any kind produce a moving directed light source in a forest at 50 yards. I agreed. I have not found a natural phenomenon in any reading I've done since that accounts for what we both saw. I have not gone back to that basin. Derek made a specific point of telling me separately, a few weeks after the trip, that the part that stuck with him most was not the light. It was Scout. Derek has known Scout since he was a puppy, and in 3 years of camping together had never seen him press himself against a person out of fear rather than standing his ground. Whatever Scout smelled or heard or otherwise perceived at the edge of that forest was something that overrode 3 years of instinct and confidence and made him want to be as small and as close to a human as possible. I have read enough since that trip to have a framework for what might explain consecutive nights of escalating wrongness in the backcountry of northern New Mexico, in the mountains above land that has been inhabited for a very long time by people who know those mountains better than any map. I am not going to state that framework as a conclusion because I do not think I have earned the right to draw that conclusion, and because the people whose tradition it belongs to treat it with a specific seriousness that I want to respect. What I will say is that the framework exists, that the people who have lived in that country for generations have language for what we experienced across those 4 nights, and that their language takes it seriously in a way that I now do too.